Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Tax in 10 with me, Rachel Souza, and Andrew Robbins. We are both tax partners in RSM's London office, and we have a wealth of experience in dealing with a wide range of private client matters. Your feedback is valuable to us, so do keep it coming, especially if you have thoughts on any topics you would like us to cover. Now, there has been a lot of media interest in taxes generally over the past few weeks. But Andrew, what I want to talk about today is something that has so far got not very much publicity, and that's inheritance tax. Because I saw a comment recently that it is the most hated of our taxes, and that more than half of people surveyed wanted it abolished.
I've heard that said before, and I've always found it puzzling because, historically, the proportion of the population that will actually pay IHT is tiny. It's always seemed odd to me that people worry so much about IHT issues when most of us will never be affected by them in the first place.
Well, of course, that may have been true in the past, but in today's world, it's the principle of the state taking a large chunk of your wealth, which will have already been taxed, coupled with the fact that nowadays you only need modest wealth to be affected. And I think really this is a combination of factors, isn't it? But it includes the freezing of the IHT nil rate band and the effect of inflation, and of course, particularly in house prices, but now more than generally on people's overall wealth.
Yes, I think we could have a long political debate about whether IHT is a fundamentally good thing or not, but I'm not even going to try that because I know you wouldn't let me. But even setting that aside, we know that the Conservative Party sort of aspirationally would like to abolish IHT altogether. But we also know that the reality is that that is not going to happen anytime soon. So I accept there is an increasing exposure to IHT, and that is going to carry on being a real problem. And as you suggest, the number of people affected is just going to carry on going up and up.
Okay, so we know there's a problem, and we also know there is a fairly limited range of solutions. It's not going to surprise anybody that if I say when it comes to IHT, you either have to spend it, give it away, or else face the consequences. But as a reminder to us all, let's quickly run through what those options actually are.
Yeah. So the spending it option is pretty self-explanatory. I know my father perfected the art of skiing some years ago, and I think is well on track to spend the kid's inheritance by the time of his death to avoid any IHT problems. But for a lot of people, the idea that you can arrange your life so that the day before you die, you've reduced your estate base just below the IHT threshold is not very realistic.
Yeah, I agree. And exactly, most people, we don't know exactly when we're going to die. And of course, we've got to retain sufficient liquid funds plus capital in the form of houses to live in. So simply spending it all on red wine and fancy holidays isn't going to be practical, however appealing that might be. And I think the same thing applies to making gifts, doesn't it? Working with a good wealth planner can be really helpful to identify how much you can afford to give away, but it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah, and picking up on that thought, one of the issues about making gifts can be having the right sort of assets to give away in the first place. It's really common to see somebody whose wealth is, say, largely in the form of their home and pension funds, and neither of those assets are things you can give away during your life. So, although I know that equity release has historically had a really bad name, taking borrowing against assets like your home or investment portfolio can actually be a really good way to create liquidity that you can then give away while you're alive. So the idea here, of course, is just simply that let's say I've got a £2 million house. I borrow £1 million against it, which means I've now got cash of £1 million that I can give away today. That immediately reduces my estate. And then on my death, the loan is repaid when the house is sold. This is a really nice solution, but it's not without its own issues. I mean, the first of which, of course, is you're never going to be able to borrow 100% of the value of your assets or anywhere near it. And also, actually, availability of those sorts of loans is generally more restricted the less wealthy you are.
That's true. And on top of that, not everybody wants to make gifts during their life. So we should also think about assets that are exempt from IHT. And that basically means business or agricultural property relief. I don't think this is the place to discuss the pros and cons of buying a farm, but it is worth reminding ourselves that you can get 100% IHT under BPR for unquoted trading companies once you've held those shares for 2 years. And of course, you don't need to be a majority shareholder, and AIM shares qualify for this relief. As a result, there are a number of AIM share portfolio approaches available that allow you to spread the investment risk while holding an asset that will be completely free from IHT, after the 2-year holding period.
I'm going to push aside the image of you knee deep in mud, mucking out the pigs.
You never know.
But you are absolutely right, I think, especially on the BPR and the AIM shares thing. There are a couple of risk areas that people need to understand when they're thinking about those sorts of solutions, of course. The first one is obviously the investment risk. Although an AIM portfolio will help spread your risk there is always the chance that the value of your investment is going to fall significantly. In some cases, liquidity can be a problem as well. And when you want to unwind the investment under death, are you going to be able to do it quickly? The other worry on the horizon is actually, how long is BPR going to stay in its current form? It's always possible that BPR rates could be reduced. In the old days, you used to get 50% and 30%, not the current 100%. Or it's not inconceivable that AIM shares could just be excluded from relief altogether. So being my natural pessimist, worst case scenario, you could find yourself holding quite a risky share portfolio with no IHT relief at all when the rules change.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that investment advice should be obtained before you make any investment decisions. And there is always the risk that a future government will thoroughly overhaul inheritance tax and could even abolish it. Lastly, of course, we haven't mentioned charitable giving. And it's worth remembering that if you leave, it's about 10% of your estate to charity, your actual IHT rate reduces from 40% to 36%.
And kind of circling back to where we started almost, but I do accept that there is actually a case for IHT being abolished. Although I would argue you then replace it with something else, like a deemed capital gain on death. A change like that would significantly simplify the tax system. It would also be nice just to see all of these stupid small IHT allowances being swept away. It just feels kind of like a slap in the face these days for the government to say, if your child is getting married, you can give them £5,000 to pay for the marriage. Not living in the real world.
No, indeed. But one other point, it's just interesting, isn't it, that during COVID, we saw a small increase in clients wanting to discuss their IHT planning. However, it was just a small blip and hasn't been maintained. And clients seem to be back to sort of head in the sand mentality when really they should be actively managing their IHT exposure and at the very least reviewing their options, even if they decide not to act.
Yeah, agreed. Anyway, that's enough death and destruction. So, Rachel, do you have a recommendation for me?
I do this week. So again, back onto my themes of, sort of not very challenging things to watch or read. So it's another program or series on Netflix. So this one's called Designated Survivor. So it's Keith Sutherland, and I can never pronounce his name right, but anyway, him. Who is the designated survivor, i.e. he is like your substitute president when the president gets blown up and all the rest of the US politicians get blown up. So it's a White House intrigue political drama, And for me, again, it's something I find it's something you can dip into, dip out of, watch it for 10 minutes and come back to it a couple of days later. Just works really nicely. So that's my tip this week: Designated Survivor on Netflix.
Fantastic.
Right. So, thank you all for listening. Please let us have your comments and feedbacks as usual. And remember, we can be contacted on rachel.d'Souza@rsmuk.com or andrew.robbins@rsmuk.com. Until next time.
Bye.